During the First Age, the war against the Morgoth was constantly hindered by a single problem: a lack of unity. Instead of providing a single united front, the Elves and later men had many different leaders, many of whom had completely different priorities. On top of that, many of them didn't get along with each other, to the point of where they would eventually end up destroying each other, doing Morgoth's work for him. So in this video, we explain the factions of the First Age, who led them, how powerful were they, and how did they get along with everyone else. Okay, so in the First Age, there were three major groups: the Noldor, the exiles who had returned to Middle-earth with the specific goal of pursuing a war against Morgoth; there was the Sindar, those Teleri elves who had never ventured to Valinor; and there were the Edain, the three houses of men who showed up later in the First Age. There were also a number of smaller groups: the Lyquendi, or Green Elves, of Osiriand, the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and later on, more groups of men known as the Easterlings. Let's start with the Noldor because they played the most prominent role in the war against Morgoth. Before they came to Middle-earth, the Noldor did have a king, Finwë, but his murder at the hands of Morgoth led to the rebellion of the Noldor. Although Feanor became king, his divisive personality and rhetoric led to the Noldor splitting into three different groups, each led by a son of Finwë: the House of Feanor, the House of Fingolfin, and the House of Finarfin. Each led their own respective host during the March to Middle-earth, but Finarfin himself would turn back with many of his people, and the remainder of the house would be led by his eldest son, Finrod. Feanor died shortly after reaching Middle-earth, but before his eldest son, Maedhros, could become king, he was captured and held prisoner by Morgoth. He was rescued by Fingon, the eldest son of Fingolfin, and thanks to this rescue, and looking to make amends for Feanor's actions towards his younger brother, Maedhros relinquished the kingship and handed it to Fingolfin. This prevented a civil war, but did not completely heal the damages, and the simple truth was that the more extreme Feanorians would not be able to live side by side with the House of Fingolfin and the House of Finarfin. So the different peoples went their separate ways, and settled in different parts of Beleriand. So Fingolfin was the High King of the Noldor, and although he was a well-respected figure, in reality this was kind of just an honorary title, as most of the Noldor did not answer directly to him. The three houses retained their own leaders and their own independence. Most of the House of Fingolfin settled in the land of Hithlum, where High King Fingolfin was their leader. The Feanorians, settling in East Beleriand, took Maedhros as their leader, and the House of Finarfin, mostly settling in Nargothrond, took King Finrod Felagund as their leader. Let's talk about the House of Fingolfin first. As I just said, they settled in the land known as Hithlum, with Fingon, son of Fingolfin, ruling over the smaller land of Dor-Lomin within Hithlum as a direct vassal of his father. Their people were a mix of Noldor and the Mithrim Sindar, who had already lived in Hithlum before the Noldor arrived. Initially, they seemed to have been the strongest faction in the war against Morgoth, but they did also do the brunt of the fighting, leading to them weakening over time. After the death of Fingolfin in the Battle of Sudden Flame, Fingon would take over, his short reign ending after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where Hithlum was effectively destroyed. But like I said before, Fingolfin did not rule over all of the House of Fingolfin. His second son, Turgon, had a following of his own, once again made up of both Noldor and Mithrim Sindar. He would initially settle in Vinyamar, a city overlooking the sea on the edge of the region of Nevrast, but due to the Vala Ulmo's advice, he and his people would build the hidden city of Gondolin, and from there, they would have limited contact with their allies and play little part in the war, except in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where Gondolin would send an army of 10,000 to help. Turgon would also call himself king, eventually becoming High King after the deaths of his father and brother, but like them, he was soon killed when Gondolin was found and destroyed. Next is the House of Finarfin. As I said earlier, Finarfin would turn back before Middle-earth, and ended up becoming king of the Noldor in Valinor, leading to Finrod taking over leadership of the house. Finrod would end up founding the Kingdom of Nargothrond, once again made up of both Noldor and Sindar. Although we don't quite know how powerful Nargothrond was in the beginning, we do know that over the course of the First Age, the kingdom swelled in power thanks to refugees from the north, and also because Nargothrond did not participate as actively in the war against Morgoth. This changed after Finrod's death and the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Under the leadership of Orodreth, Finrod's nephew, Nargothrond would eventually be destroyed by Morgoth's forces. Finrod's brothers, Angrod and Aegnor, also had followers of their own, although they are stated to have been vassals beneath Finrod. They settled in the northern hills of Dorthonion, but owing to its closeness to Angband and the ruggedness of the land, their people never numbered many, although they were strong enough to survive one direct assault in the Dagor Aglareb, the Glorious Battle. They were overrun during the Battle of Sudden Flame, and both brothers were killed. Angrod's son, the aforementioned Orodref, also had a fief of his own, the fortress of Minas Tirith that guarded the Vale of Sirion. This would fall to Sauron after the Battle of Sudden Flame, and Orodref would flee to Nargothrond, where he would eventually become king. Finally, we have the Feanorians, the House of Feanor. Although Maedhros relinquished the kingship, much to the disappointment of some of his younger brothers, he was still very much the independent leader of the Feanorians, who settled in East Beleriand. They made up a minority of the Noldor, but their followers were the most warlike, and even after many devastating defeats, they could still muster the strength to kill their fellow elves. Maedhros ruled from his fortress of Himring, but his 6 younger brothers had lands of their own. Maglor watched over Maglor's Gap, Caranthir ruled the land of Fargelion from his fortress at Lake Helavorn, Celegorm and Curufin ruled over the land of Himlad, and the twins Amrod and Amros ruled over the lands around Amon Ereb. Following the Battle of Sudden Flame, the brothers would lose most of their lands, with the exception of Himring and Amon Ereb. However, they did recover these lands, only to then lose all of them permanently following the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Of course, the Noldor weren't the only major players. I've already mentioned them a few times now, as many of them lived under the Noldor, but there were lots of Sindar in Beleriand as well. In fact, they actually outnumbered the Noldor. The largest and most important of the Sindar realms was Doriath, ruled by King Thingol. King Thingol's power once extended across all of Beleriand, and all of those people called him king. But the first battles of Beleriand put an end to that, and Thingol withdrew his strength into Doriath, which was protected by a magical barrier called the Girdle of Melian. Despite this, Doriath was still a major power in Beleriand. It dominated central Beleriand, so if you weren't on Thingol's good terms, you had to pass the remote lands to the south or the dangerous lands to the north to get around it. Like Nargothrond and Gondolin, Doriath didn't play a large role in the war, fighting only when it had to, so as a result, Thingol's power grew throughout the First Age owing to Sindar refugees. Unfortunately, Thingol never really got to put his strength to the test. He was murdered by dwarves, and the reeling, demoralized kingdom ended up being sacked by a dwarven army shortly afterwards. The kingdom experienced a brief revival under Dior, the half-elven grandson of Thingol, but this came to an end when it was surprise attacked and destroyed by the Feanorians in the Second Kinslaying. The other Sindar player, although nowhere near as major as Doriath, was the Falas, ruled by Lord Círdan the Shipwright. At the start of the First Age, Círdan seems to have been a vassal of Doriath, but after the latter's withdrawal after the first battle, Círdan and the Falafrim became more aligned with the Noldor, and the Falas would soon become a safe haven for many Noldoran and Sindar refugees, including Gil-galad, son of Orodref and future High King of the Noldor. But following the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Falas was destroyed by Morgoth's forces, and the Falafrim retreated to the Isle of Balar. Now, let's talk about the Edain, the 3 houses of men who entered Beleriand from the east in the early years of the 4th century of the First Age. Although men would soon outnumber elves, during this time the Edain were quite small in number, and in a rare occasion, Tolkien actually gives us those numbers. When they first arrived, the House of Beor numbered around 5,000, the House of Halef slightly more, and the House of Hador around 15,000. Of course, these numbers would grow, but during the major battles of the First Age, men would always play second fiddle to the elves. Initially, the House of Beor and Hador would settle in Estelad, and there remained a large mixed population until the Battle of Sudden Flame, whereas the House of Halef initially settled in southern Thargelion. These were only temporary accommodations. Beor, the leader of the House of Beor at the time, got on splendidly with King Finrod Felagund, and as a result, his people would eventually migrate to Ladros in the land of Dorthonion, serving besides Angrod and Agnor as vassals of Nargothrond. Unfortunately, the House of Beor's time in Ladros would be relatively short, as they were either killed or forced to flee after the Battle of Sudden Flame. The survivors of the house mostly merged with the House of Hador, but some also merged with the House of Halef. The House of Haleth, the most aloof of the three houses, had their initial lands in the south of Thargelion, but after being attacked by orcs, their new leader Haleth led her people to Estelad and eventually to Brethil. Brethil was technically part of Doriath, but no elves lived there, so King Thingol was willing to relinquish it provided the Haladin do their bit in defending Doriath's western approaches. Although they were always relatively weak in strength, the Haladin always provided soldiers for war, and did a good job of defending their lands, outlasting both of the other houses. Unfortunately, while the Haladin could survive Morgoth, they could not survive a civil war, mostly destroying themselves around the start of the 6th century. The final and most powerful house by far was the House of Hador. The Hadorians would also leave Estelad and would eventually take up service under High King Fingolfin and settled in Dor Loman. Many would move to the southern slopes of Ered Weathrin afterwards, but under the leadership of Hador, they would return and serve valiantly as some of Fingolfin's and later Fingon's best warriors. Unfortunately, like the rest of Hiflum, they were overrun after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and the Hadorians would become enslaved under the Easterlings. Okay, so we're through our major players. Let's talk about the lesser ones. First, we have the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains. I know, maybe unfair to call them lesser, because as far as we know, both the cities of Nogrod and Belagost were quite rich and powerful, but they played a relatively minor role in the wars of Beleriand. Apart from defending their own territory, we're only told of twice when they actually marched to war: Belagost at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and Nogrod against Doriath. Rather sadly for the Dwarves, both cities survived Morgoth, but neither city survived the cataclysm that accompanied the War of Wrath. Right next to the Blue Mountains was another small force, the Green Elves of Osiriand. They were a nature-loving people, as far from warlike as you could get, but under their first and only king, Denethor, they did take part in the first battles of Beleriand. The battle was a disaster for them, and although they were saved by Thingol's forces, Denethor and many others died. Afterwards, some of the Green Elves migrated to Doriath for better protection, but the ones that remained in Osiriand became almost completely isolationist. To be fair, this worked out for them, and they were one of the few lands to survive Morgoth's forces, although much of Osiriand still perished after the War of Wrath. Our last faction are the Easterlings. These are men entirely unrelated to the Edain, who arrived in Beleriand following the Battle of Sudden Flame and would take up service under the Feanorians. They were split into two main factions, the House of Bor and the House of Ulfang. The House of Bor would take up service beneath Maglor, and the House of Ulfang would take up service beneath Caranthir. As it would turn out, while the House of Bor was loyal, the House of Ulfang were traitors who actually served Morgoth. Their betrayal would be felt during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and the Easterlings would then receive their reward, and also punishment, the land of Hiflum, where they would enslave and rule over the remaining elves and Edain there. Alright, so there's a broad overview of all the factions of the First Age. There's more to be learned about them, but for the sake of keeping the video at a watchable length, let's jump into the next part, the relations between all of these factions. Because as I said at the start, it was the lack of unity which severely hampered the Elves and the Edain. The relations between many of these groups was complex, and it sometimes changed massively due to certain events that could have major ramifications in not just the First Age, but also in the ages beyond. I started with the House of Fingolfin, and I want to start with them again, because it's quite easy. The House of Fingolfin were well respected, and pretty much got along with everyone. Fingolfin and then Fingon were well liked, and were able to rally the Elves and the Edain behind them. Although there were issues when they first arrived in Beleriand, owing to Feanor's behaviour, Fingon and Maedhros' friendship ensured that the House of Fingolfin and the Feanorians got along, at least officially. Some of Maedhros' younger brothers were less amicable. And if we're talking best friends, then the bond between the Hadorians and the House of Fingolfin was also exceptional. Another well-liked faction was the House of Finarfin, and a lot of this was to do with Finrod himself, who had a habit of making friends wherever he went. The House of Fingolfin and the House of Finarfin always got along because Fingolfin and Finarfin were completely fine with each other, unlike with Feanor. Owing to their kinship, the House of Finarfin also got along with King Thingol of Doriath, the best out of any of the Noldor, and several members of the house lived there at certain stages. The House of Finarfin also forged an alliance with the Falafrim, and the Noldor of Nargothrond would fortify the havens of Brithombar and Aglarest and build the Tower of Barad Nimras, which was completely useless. And of course, the House of Finarfin also forged a strong bond with the House of Beor of the Edain, and were also allies with the House of Halef in Brethil. An interesting relationship was between the House of Finarfin and the Feanorians. Finrod got along with several of the brothers, Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, and Curufin at the very least, whereas his brothers, Angrod and Aegnor, despised the Feanorians, especially Caranthir. After the Battle of Sudden Flame, Celegorm, Curufin, and their people actually took refuge in Nargothrond and were fine, until the quest for the Silmaril happened. The brothers then screwed everything up, basically sending Finrod to his death, usurping power from Orodreth, and abducting Luthien, the daughter of King Thingol, which almost led to a war between Doriath and Nargothrond. The brothers were eventually banished, but the damage was done, and the relations between Nargothrond and the Feanorians became so poor that Nargothrond barely sent any help to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Now that we're talking about the Feanorians, let's continue to talk about them, as there is a lot to unpack here. The Feanorians were obviously a source of lots of controversy, firstly thanks to Feanor himself, and then thanks to his sons. Even though Maedhros was mostly an amicable guy, several of his younger brothers, Celegorm, Curufin, and Caranthir, were firebrands who weren't afraid to cause problems, even if it damaged the whole Feanorian cause of retrieving the Silmarils. Firstly, we'll talk about who the Feanorians got along with. As I've mentioned, the House of Fingolfin, and while Finrod was the leader, they officially got on with the House of Finarfin. They seemingly got along well with the Dwarves, they didn't have any issues with men, and ended up swearing the Easterlings into their service, and oddly enough, they seem to have gotten along well with the Green Elves, as that's who the surviving Feanorians joined after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. However, apart from the bad relations with Nargothrond that occurred later, the Feanorians were also sworn enemies of King Thingol of Doriath. Thingol resented the Feanorian role in the kinslaying at Alcalonde, and the Feanorians looked down on Thingol. This only got worse when Thingol ended up with a Silmaril and refused to turn it over to them, resulting in Celegorm swearing to kill him after he returned victorious from the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Neither happened. Thingol died to Dwarves, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears was a massive loss. But that did not stop the weakened Feanorians from marching on Doriath afterwards, performing the second kinslaying and killing King Dior. The Feanorian problem with Nargothrond and Doriath caused severe problems for the entire war effort. When it came to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Union of Maedhros, especially Maedhros' own eastern force, needed all the manpower it could get. Thanks to terrible relations, the Elves of Nargothrond sent a single company to Fingon's western force, and from Doriath, no help came with the exception of two elves, Mablung and Beleg, who were expressly forbidden from serving under Maedhros. The Sons of Feanor and their oath, and their inability to keep their mouths shut, robbed the Union of two armies of the strongest remaining kingdoms. All this being said, King Thingol wasn't exactly a saint himself. He could be quick to judgment and harsh with his verdicts, although he could also be surprisingly understanding and merciful. Under him, Doriath formed a strong friendship with their fellow Teleri, the Sindar of the Falas, and the Green Elves of Ossiriand. As mentioned earlier, they had a bond of kinship with the House of Finarfin, and got along well enough with the House of Fingolfin. To begin with, Thingol looked down upon the Edain, but he would eventually cooperate with the House of Halef, and his own fate was intertwined with members from both the House of Beor and the House of Hador. I've already spoken about how Thingol and the Feanorians hated each other, but another interesting relationship that Doriath enjoyed, at least for a while, was with the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains. The Dwarves helped build Menegroth, the capital of Doriath, and crafted many great works for the Sindar, who in return would provide things like pearls from the Falas, which the Dwarves valued highly, and food that was grown on the plains outside Doriath. This working relationship fell apart when Thingol commissioned the Dwarves of Nogrod to place the Silmaril in the Nauglamir. The Dwarves then became jealous, desiring the Nauglamir as technically they had given it to Finrod, and he was now dead. Thingol denied them, harsh words were said, and the Dwarves murdered the king. Some of the murderers made it back to Nogrod, where they lied about what happened. The Dwarves of Nogrod assembled an army, marched on the defenseless Doriath, which was sacked. However, the Dwarven army would never make it home, attacked by Green Elves led by Beren, and the survivors finished off by Ents. The sacking was not overly bloodthirsty, as Doriath did survive and rise again, but irreparable damage had been done between the Sindar elves and dwarves. This new hatred even extended beyond the dwarves of Nogrod to the dwarves of Belagost, who had actually tried reasoning with their cousins to stay home, and it was felt in the Second and Third Age when the princes of the Sindar who had survived Doriath went east and founded new realms. Many of them disliked the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with the war between Nogrod and Doriath. I'll also talk about the Falas. As you may know, Círdan generally got along with everyone. The Falafrim were initially something of vassals to Thingol, but this changed after the first battles when Thingol could no longer really protect them. Then, the Falafrim befriended the Noldor. They were close to the House of Finarfin, who fortified their cities, and they were close to the House of Fingolfin, and despite the Falas being distant to the front line, they always provided support to High King Fingon, support which was valuable in the days of Hithlum's waning strength. Lastly, let's talk about the Edain. As I mentioned earlier, each house of the Edain were either vassals or worked closely with certain elven factions. The House of Beor was in service to the House of Finarfin, the House of Hador was in service to the House of Fingolfin, and the House of Halef, although not in service to either, worked closely with the House of Finarfin and the Elves of Doriath. Interestingly enough, the Edain didn't have a huge amount to do with the Feanorians, although at least one individual is known to have served with them, and at least on first contact, the Green Elves were quite pleased to see the Edain move along and not linger in Osiriand. But who the Edain did not get along well with were the Easterlings, although their dealings were limited before the Easterling betrayal. This goes back many centuries to when Morgoth first corrupted men. The Edain were those who rejected the corruption and were then violently pursued by the men who would have been the ancestors of the Easterlings. As we later saw, some men, such as the House of Bor, could repent and served faithfully, but they were presumably wiped out or assimilated following the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. So whether the Edain ever had any appreciation for them specifically is unknown. All we do know is that after the War of Wrath, when the surviving Easterlings fled west, it was not on good terms with the Edain. So there you have it, the factions of the First Age explained. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I don't cover the First Age all that much compared to the Third Age on this channel, and truthfully, that's because less people care about it, unfortunately. I don't really know what topics from the First Age that people are interested in or would want to get covered. So if you have any First Age specific topics, please comment below. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if something bad First Age, blame either Morgoth or Feanor. Easy.